Something significant has shifted in the world of personal computing in 2026, and it is backed by data, confirmed by governments, and reflected in how millions of ordinary people are choosing to use their computers. Understand what Microsoft did and failed to do that helped trigger this shift, and learn how governments across Europe are now making decisions that could permanently alter the global software landscape. For more than 2 decades, a running joke in the technology community was the phrase "Year of Linux on the desktop." Every year, someone would declare it. Every year, nothing much happened. Windows stayed dominant, Linux stayed niche, and the whole thing became a kind of inside joke. That joke has a harder time landing now. According to StatCounter data, Standing Linux's global desktop market share reached 4.7% by the end of 2025. That number might not sound dramatic at first, but consider what it represents in context. In July 2022, Linux held just 2.76% of the global desktop market. In roughly 3 years, that figure grew by over 70%. The trajectory is not a spike, it is a sustained climb. More telling than the global number is what happened in the United States. In June 2025, Linux crossed the 5% threshold in the US for the first time in its history. That is not a rounding error or a data anomaly. It is a milestone. And the US Digital Analytics Program, which tracks the operating systems used to visit federal government websites, reported that 6% of visitors were running Linux as of mid-2025. Yet India tells an even sharper story. Linux already holds a 16% desktop adoption rate there, more than 3 times the global average. That figure reflects a combination of cost sensitivity, a large developer community, and government programs that have actively promoted open source software for years. Analysts at several research firms project that if current trends continue, Linux could reach 6% global desktop market share by late 2026. That projection was made before several additional tailwinds emerged, which we will get to shortly. To put all of this in dollar terms, the global Linux operating system market was valued at roughly $22 billion in 2024. One set of projections puts that figure approaching $100 billion by 2032, with a compound annual growth rate above 20%. Another industry research firm estimates the market at over $24 billion in 2026 alone, growing toward $52 billion by 2035. The specific figures vary by methodology, but every credible forecast points in the same direction. And if you think Linux is just a desktop story, the server numbers are even more one-sided. Linux powers approximately 78% of web-facing servers worldwide. It runs 100% of the world's top 500 supercomputers, every single one of them, a record that has been held since 2017. Even cloud workloads on platforms like AWS, Google Cloud, and Azure run on Linux at around 90%. Among Fortune 500 companies, roughly 73% run mission-critical workloads on Linux. The desktop has historically been Linux's weak point. That is now the part that is changing. On October 14, 2025, Microsoft officially ended free support for Windows 10. That meant no more security patches, no more bug fixes, no more updates, unless users enrolled in a paid extended security updates program. For home users and small businesses, that program was simply not a realistic option. The obvious alternative was Windows 11. The problem is that Windows 11 requires hardware that a large portion of the world's computers simply do not have. It demands TPM 2.0, Secure Boot, UEFI, and a CPU from Microsoft's approved list. Thus a list that excluded many 6th and 7th generation Intel processors and early AMD Ryzen chips. According to analysis from research firm Canalys, approximately 240 million computers currently running Windows 10 did not meet the minimum requirements for Windows 11. Those are not ancient machines gathering dust in a closet. Many of them are perfectly capable of running a modern operating system. They just cannot run Microsoft's. So, what are the people with those machines supposed to do? Microsoft's implicit answer is buy new hardware. And Microsoft made this increasingly clear by tying its flagship new feature set, branded Copilot Plus, to a specific tier of AI-capable processors from Intel, AMD, and Qualcomm, requiring at minimum 16 gigabytes of RAM and 256 gigabytes of storage. For users who just want to browse the web, check their email, edit documents, this felt less like progress and more like being pushed off a ledge. The response was measurable. Zorn OS, a Linux distribution designed specifically to ease the transition from Windows, reported that over 780,000 Windows users had transitioned to Linux in the wake of the Windows 10 end-of-life announcements. Linux Mint, another beginner-friendly distribution, saw similar spikes in downloads. Grassroots campaigns, most notably the End of 10 project, organized community efforts to help users move their aging hardware to Linux rather than discard it. The e-waste dimension of this situation is worth pausing on. Perfectly functional laptops and desktops that ran Windows 10 without complaint were effectively being rendered obsolete by a software policy, not by any hardware failure. Linux distributions do not carry these requirements. They run on hardware that is a decade old or more. For users who could not justify or afford a hardware refresh, Linux represented a real, practical alternative, one that let them extend the life of their device and stay protected with security updates. Then there is the broader question of trust. Windows 11 has continued expanding its telemetry, the data Microsoft collects about how you use your computer. It has integrated advertising features into the operating system itself. It has made it progressively more difficult to set up a local account without a Microsoft account. And it nudges users toward cloud services at nearly every turn. For a growing number of users, these are not minor annoyances. They are reasons to leave. As of early 2025, only around 30% of PCs globally had made the move to Windows 11, despite years of Microsoft pushing the upgrade. That is a remarkably low adoption rate for what is supposed to be a free update to the world's most widely used operating system. The people who have not upgraded are not lazy. Many of them are waiting, evaluating, and in growing numbers, they are deciding that waiting means looking elsewhere. Individual users making quiet choices about their own computers is one thing. When entire national governments start making those same choices, the implications are of a different order entirely. The German state of Schleswig-Holstein made international headlines with its plan to replace 30,000 Microsoft Windows and Office computers with Linux and LibreOffice by 2026. It was described by analysts as potentially one of the largest Linux deployments in the history of the European public sector. Denmark went even further. In 2025, the Danish Ministry of Digital Affairs announced a transition away from Microsoft Office and Windows across government systems, moving toward open source platforms. Copenhagen and the city of Aarhus followed the same direction. The financial dimension of that vulnerability is concrete. Copenhagen's Microsoft software bill grew from roughly 313 million Danish kroner in 2018 to 538 million kroner in 2023. That's a 72% increase over 5 years. Switzerland passed legislation mandating that government-developed software be released as open source and committed $231 million. At the EU level, a community-led initiative called EUOS emerged. Sook, a proposal for a standardized Linux desktop distribution built specifically for European public sector organizations. The project is spearheaded by a researcher at the European Data Protection Supervisor, and its goals center on reducing reliance on proprietary software, improving GDPR compliance, and giving governments control over their own data and digital infrastructure. The Linux Foundation's 2025 World of Open Source Europe report, based on input from more than 300 European IT leaders, found that open source adoption was highest in operating systems at 64%, followed by cloud and container technologies at 55%. The report was also blunt about what was missing: a cohesive strategy, genuine leadership commitment, and meaningful policy alignment. The Foundation called for an EU-level sovereign tech agency to fund the maintenance of critical open source infrastructure. Whether that comes to pass or not, the political will behind these decisions is real, and it is accelerating. This is not simply about ideology or a preference for open software. It is about geopolitical risk, fiscal control, data sovereignty, and the hard-learned lesson that complete dependence on a single foreign software vendor is a strategic liability. The fact that multiple European governments reach similar conclusions independently and are now acting on them is something the software industry cannot ignore. For a long time, gaming was the argument that ended most conversations about switching to Linux. If you play games, stay on Windows. That argument has not disappeared entirely, but it is considerably weaker than it was even 2 years ago. Valve's Proton compatibility layer is the technology at the center of this change. Proton, developed in collaboration with Codeweavers, translates the calls that Windows games make to Windows-specific APs into instructions that Linux can understand, using technologies like DXVK and VKD 3D Proton to handle graphics. What this means in practice is that many Windows games can run on Linux without the game developer doing anything additional to support it. In October 2025, the Steam Hardware and Software Survey showed Linux crossing the 3% mark among active Steam users, the highest level since Steam for Linux originally launched more than a decade ago. To put that in real terms, Steam recorded a peak of 41.6 million concurrent users in October 2025. Each 1% of that number represents hundreds of thousands of players. 3% is not a rounding error. The hardware driving much of this is Valve's Steam Deck, a handheld gaming PC that runs SteamOS, a Linux-based operating system by default. IDC estimates put total Steam Deck shipments in the low millions since its 2022 launch. Every one of those devices is a Linux installation in the hands of someone who may never have intentionally chosen Linux. Sub on the Deck did something that years of Linux advocacy could not. It put a polished, supported Linux gaming device in front of mainstream consumers without asking them to think about operating systems at all. Valve released Proton 10.03 in November 2025, bringing compatibility fixes and performance improvements for dozens of titles, including fixes for specific hardware like OLED Steam Deck displays and improvements to anti-cheat handling for certain multiplayer games. Community database ProtonDB now lists thousands of titles as playable or better on Linux. The remaining friction in Linux gaming is real and worth acknowledging honestly. Kernel-level anti-cheat systems, technology used in many competitive multiplayer titles to detect cheating, remain a significant barrier. Some major publishers have explicitly declined to enable Proton support for their multiplayer games, citing concerns about exploit vectors and engineering trade-offs. Anti-cheat vendors, BattleEye, and Easy Anti-Cheat have made technical progress toward Linux compatibility, but publisher adoption is inconsistent. For gamers whose libraries are heavy with competitive online titles, Linux remains a constrained experience. For gamers focused on single-player, indie, or story-driven titles, the situation in 2026 is meaningfully better than it has ever been. There is a dimension of this story that often gets less attention than the consumer side, but may ultimately matter more: the developer community. The Stack Overflow Developer Survey for 2025 found that 27.8% of developers use Ubuntu, a Linux distribution, C for personal use, and 27.7% use it professionally. Add in Debian, Arch, Fedora, Red Hat, and other distributions, and Linux is clearly the working environment of choice for a large share of the global developer community. According to one industry report, approximately 78.5% of developers use Linux as a primary or secondary operating system. This matters because software developers shape what gets built next. When the people writing applications live inside a Linux environment, the toolchains, libraries, and workflows they build tend to be Linux compatible by default. The gap between what developers use and what ordinary users use has historically been wide. That gap is narrowing. So where does this leave us? Is 2026 the year Linux wins? No, that is not what is happening. Dead End claiming otherwise would be misleading. Windows remains dominant on the desktop by an enormous margin. There are real, legitimate reasons why millions of users and organizations stay on Windows. Those factors do not evaporate because Linux's market share ticked upward. What is happening is something more durable and in some ways more significant than an overnight reversal. A set of converging pressures have created conditions for sustained multi-front growth. The governments that are moving to Linux are not doing it as a protest. They are doing it because they have calculated that the long-term costs and risks of dependence on proprietary foreign software outweigh the short-term friction of migration. That calculation, once it takes root in policy, tends to persist. If you found this useful, and consider sharing it with someone who has been on the fence about Linux. The conversation is worth having.